Hello and welcome to your Ticket to Ride. I'm Scott Muni, and for this week, it's my pleasure to have Billy Joel as our very special guest. Billy will play some of his favorite Beatles songs as well as recall many fond memories of the group. We'll also take our usual look at the doings from this week in Beatle history, and we'll have another cover song and trivia questions, so stay with us. Your Ticket to Ride gets underway right after this.
She's got a ticket to ride, but she don't care.
This is Billy Joel with my special guest Scott Muni and your Ticket to Ride.
Sing us a song.
Billy Joel's an artist who needs no introduction. He is easily among rock and roll's most elite singer-songwriters, and his music has been a part of our lives for well over 10 years now. Billy recently dropped into our studios in New York, and we had a long talk about the Beatles. Way back in young Billy Joel days, you, as a lot of the musicians today, are studying classical music with piano, which wasn't too difficult to do because piano is an outstanding instrument, classic. And listening to some Beatle things and all, as you just mentioned, did that help influence you to change into and get yourself involved in what you really wanted to do, rock and roll?
Oh, definitely. I really had no idea that it was possible to be a rock and roll star until the Beatles. Before the Beatles, there was either soul music, and I was a kid from Levittown, so what kind of soul did I have at that point? I wasn't aware that I had any. I thought you had to be from the, ghetto in Philadelphia. And there were the manufactured rock stars, a Fabian or Frankie Avalon, or the pretty boys who seemed to be put together by a Hollywood conglomerate with a lot of money behind them. And there was really no idea that you could play an instrument, write your own music, go out and perform it, and be big at it. It looked like, that wasn't in the cards. And I saw the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. They were these guys. They didn't look like they came from the San Fernando Valley. They looked like these four working-class scruffs. John Lennon had this wise guy look on his face, just like me and my friends were just a bunch of wise guys, street kids, playing their own instruments, doing their own arrangements, writing their own songs, on TV on Ed Sullivan, next to, Roberta Peters or whoever else was on. It made it all possible. It made it all conceivable. That's what I want to do. I tell you, if it wasn't for me seeing that night, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now. I might not even be around. I might not even be alive. I credit them with creating a lot of my life.
All My Lovin', and I Should Have Known Better, from the Beatles. Billy Joel and I talked about the impact of the Beatles, and like everyone I've spoken with, he credits the Beatles for paving the way for so many artists to follow. I want to go back to one thing you mentioned about the piano, because it was true, and the rock stars just before the Beatles were singers only. Sometimes they played a guitar, but they were really in hairstyle and clothes and in movement, and you mentioned the Frankie Avalon, Fabian, and all the rest of them, and Bobby Rydell and that sort of thing, and they went from one to another, and then all of a sudden, here was a group of four guys and playing and singing together with a different hairstyle than we knew. They didn't have the wraparounds, the ducktails, and the rest of that, and the big waves, and it just had something so totally different. And then Brian Epstein put them in different clothes, too, and it changed our clothing style for males. It changed our hairstyle, changed a lot of things, but most importantly, music-wise, it opened the floodgates, just as you said, and so here's Billy Joel coming through the floodgate, too.
Yeah.
And even though, from a lifespan, they had one of the shortest lifespans of a group together for being as popular as they were, and history will record that, they really weren't together that long.
No. But the amount of output that they came up with, amazing. To be able to pump out those albums the way they did, and they were all incredible albums, and there was change, so much evolution that went on with the Beatles.
Each album, right?
I grew up with them. I mean, as I got older and I changed, they changed. And it was a big part of life. That was a big deal about the 60s.
Can't buy me no reply.
No Reply and Can't Buy Me Love, two Beatles songs that set standards for everyone who wanted to play rock and roll music. As the Beatles began to grow and change, fans all over the world took notice and began to grow and change with them.
There was a period with the Beatles where their words got very obscure and was attributed to psychedelics or drugs, whatever it was. And I remember there was a time mid to later 60s, a lot of my friends were sitting around smoking banana peels going, crack-a-lack-a fishwife polyester. That means that's a reference to... And I said, come on, it's just nonsense. And it's creative nonsense. And everybody was trying to figure out the deeper meaning. The great thing about the Beatles, for people not to get hung up in this whole drug thing with them, was their music was eminently listenable without any kind of psychedelics, anything like that. That's not what they were about. I didn't do any drugs in the 60s. Everybody was, smoking. I didn't know from none of that stuff. I enjoy listening to them immensely.
I Am the Walrus. Sometimes sound like it anyway. I Am the Walrus, one of the most complicated and overanalyzed songs in the Beatles' career. When Billy Joel and I return, we'll talk about the versatility of the Beatles and how they were as a live band when your Ticket to Ride continues. Hi, I'm Scott Muni. My special guest for this and next week, too, is Billy Joel. In your stage shows and going back early days, too, where you worked everywhere, from lounges to whatever and all that, you've done some Beatles songs. Was the reaction always the same? Did you pick out Beatles songs specifically for that reason, because you enjoyed the ins and outs of their music?
They were fun to play. If you were in a band, everybody starts out in a bar band, a garage band. And in those days, Beatle tunes were on the top 10 all the time, and you played what the popular songs were. But you liked playing Beatles songs because they were so melodic, they were so musical, and they were fun. They never really leave your system. Anybody who's ever been in a bar band, to this day at sound check, still does Beatles songs. Everyone from, Led Zeppelin, the new wave groups, I know Sting has mentioned it a number of times, everybody still has those songs in their system. And when we do sound checks, we do Beatle medleys. We do Abbey Road. And it's actually sometimes it's better than the show.
Roll Over Beethoven and Ticket to Ride from the Beatles, recorded live. Billy Joel will join us again next week for more conversation about the Beatles. When Ticket to Ride returns, we'll hear a cover song from a man who used to open shows for Billy Joel. That plus a look at this week in Beatle history and a trivia question, too, when your Ticket to Ride returns. Welcome back to your Ticket to Ride. Billy Joel will be back with us next week. Right now, I'd like to play a version of Help that comes from Henry Gross. Henry spent a while as the lead guitarist of Sha Na Na, and then had a top 10 hit in the summer of '76 with Shannon. Help, as recorded by Henry Gross, this week's Beatle cover song on your Ticket to Ride. Looking at the week in Beatle history, we'll go way back to 1960. And it was that week that the Beatles' first trip to Hamburg came to an abrupt halt after George Harrison had been deported because he was too young. The rest of the Beatles were also asked to leave Hamburg after a small fire had broken out in their apartment. Paul McCartney struck a match and accidentally set a sheet on fire. The next day, they were headed back to Liverpool. 3 years later, now in London, the Beatles were in the recording studio working on these two songs for George Martin and Parlophone Records. This Boy, and I Want to Hold Your Hand. This week in 1963, the Beatles were back in the studio, but this time they weren't recording a song. Instead, they were cutting the first of their infamous Christmas greetings. We'll be hearing more of those Christmas messages in a special holiday installment of Ticket to Ride. But getting back to this week in Beatle history, it was this week in 1964 that the Beatles released a 45 that featured two great songs, Tell Me Why and If I Fell. Tell Me Why and If I Fell, both sides of a single that was issued this week in 1964. This week in 1969, John and Yoko put out their wedding album, recorded to celebrate their marriage. The album consisted of experimental songs from John and Yoko, plus some interview material, and it also came with pictures from their wedding, and even included a picture of a piece of the wedding cake. Also, this week in 1967, John Lennon appeared in a Richard Lester film. It was called How I Won the War. And that's the subject of this week's Beatle trivia question. What was the name of John Lennon's character in How I Won the War? I'll be right back with the answer, a listener letter, and more when your Ticket to Ride rolls on. I'm Scott Muni. Welcome back to Ticket to Ride. Before the break, I asked this week's Beatle trivia question. It concerned How I Won the War, a film released this week in 1967 that featured John Lennon. My question is, what was the name of the character that John Lennon portrayed? The character's name was Private Gripweed, and it's safe to say that the role was an extension of John's anti-war ideas that would make John one of the most active campaigners for peace in music history. This week we received a letter from Jim Bianco of North Bergen, New Jersey. Jim writes, Dear Scott, Paul McCartney is my all-time favorite artist, and I'd like very much to write to him and give him my opinion of his work. If it's not too much trouble, I'd like to know an address where I can write to Paul. Incidentally, my 3 favorite Beatles songs are Let It Be, It's All Too Much, and Here Comes the Sun. Thanks, Scott. Thank you for your letter, Jim, and grab a pen because I have the address that you want. You can write to Paul McCartney in care of the Wings Fan Club magazine, Club Sandwich, P.O. Box 4 Up, London, England, W1A4UP. If you'd like to write to me with a comment, a question, or your 3 favorite Beatles songs, we'd like to hear from you. Send them to Scott Muni's Ticket to Ride, Box 333, Narberth, Pennsylvania, 19072. Next week, we'll hear part 2 of my talk with Billy Joel, including Billy's special admiration for John Lennon, as well as his Beatle cover song. Till then, Scott Muni, thank you for joining me on your Ticket to Ride.
Scott Muni's Ticket to Ride was written by Kevin Gunn and produced by Tom Couch. The executive producers are Charlie Kendall and Denny Somack. This program is copyright 1985, and no portion may be reproduced or rebroadcast without express written permission. Scott Muni's Ticket to Ride is a presentation of DIR Broadcasting.